So welcome along. Today we are going to be talking about the conversion of Paul. If you were here last week, we were covering the case for the resurrection, which built upon the case that I'd laid in the previous 14 weeks, reviewing the various categories of evidence for the robust reliability of the Gospels and Acts, and indeed their grounding in credible eyewitness testimony. And this evening, we're going to be looking at an additional independent argument for the truth of Christianity, which also builds upon some of that foundation. So, as I said, we're looking at the conversion of the Apostle Paul. And why is this of evidential value? Well, in the account of which we read in Acts 9, I'm going to be arguing that the account in Acts 9 actually reflects Paul's own testimony concerning his Damascus Road conversion experience. And that being the case, Paul claimed not only that Jesus identified himself, but also that Jesus explicitly endorsed the teaching of the sect that Paul was persecuting, namely the Christian movement. He says, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting." And so that gives content to the experience of Saul of Tarsus. And when we combine that with the independent evidence that the sect that Paul was persecuting taught the physical resurrection of Jesus, that provides independent support for that content. Because the best explanation, I would contend, of Saul of Tarsus's Damascus Road conversion and of the account in Acts 9 of what occasioned that conversion is that the experience was in fact veridical, and that Paul really did have an encounter with the risen Jesus on the road to Damascus. So I'll start with introducing Gilbert West and George Littleton, who were both friends who lived during the 1700s. And I want to talk in particular this evening about George Littleton, who he was born in the small town of Hagley, England, in 1709, and he was a prolific poet. He was an Oxford graduate, statesman. He served even as a member of Parliament, and he had this good friend by the name of Gilbert West, and they both lived during the in the age of reason, when deism was all the rage. And Gilbert West and George Littleton were both very critical of Christianity. They were deists, so they were persuaded of the existence of God, but both very critical of the Christian gospel. And so together they decided to set out to falsify or disprove Christianity, and they assessed the two strongest evidences for the faith to be number one, the resurrection of Christ, which we discussed last week, and number two, the conversion of the Apostle Paul. And so George Littleton set out to disprove the conversion of Paul, and Gilbert West set out to disprove the resurrection. And after doing so, to their own shock and surprise, both actually ended up becoming Christians. And so Gilbert West said, and they both wrote books about it, about the conversion of Paul and the case for the resurrection, respectively. And Gilbert West said, and I quote, "As I have investigated the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, I have come to believe that there is something to it, and I'm going to write my book from that perspective." And George Littleton wrote, and I quote, "The same thing has happened to me. I have come to see that there was something to the conversion of St. Paul, and I'm going to write my book from that perspective." And so they did, and Littleton's book became known or bore the title of The Observations on the Conversion and Apostleship of St. Paul. And these are the two books that came out of that investigation. So this is Observations on the Conversion of St. Paul by George Littleton, and this is Observations on the History and Evidence of the Resurrection of Jesus Christ by Gilbert West. And I commend both of those to your reading. So I'm going to be basically giving the same sort of structure of argument that George Littleton offers in his book, Observations on the Conversion of St. Paul. You can find this, by the way, free online. You can find a free PDF on Archive. It's copyright free, so there's no copyright infringement because it's the copyright no longer pertains because it's so old. I'm going to begin, though, by looking at the account that we read in Acts 9 concerning Paul's conversion, and I'm going to be contending that it actually reflects, or most plausibly reflects, Paul's own testimony concerning his conversion on the road to Damascus. So here's the account in Acts 9, which I will read. This is verses 1-4. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now, as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And then we continue, verse 5. And he said, "Who are you, Lord?" And he said, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice but seeing no one. Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were opened, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And for 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. So that's Paul's conversion in the words of Luke, who's, as I've argued extensively in previous sessions, was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul, and I take that to be fairly well established. We can also go to Paul's own writings to find out what he himself says in his own words concerning his conversion. So this is in Galatians 1:13-17, where we read, "For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and who called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus." So I want to zoom in for a moment on verse 17, where he says, "Nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus." Now, this actually is evidence for the independence between Acts and Galatians. So William Paley, he is one of my heroes in church history, comments, this is in his Hora Polyni, he says, and I quote, "Besides the difference observable in the terms and general complexion of these two accounts, the journey into Arabia mentioned in the epistle and omitted in the history affords full proof that there existed no correspondence between these writers. If the narrative in the Acts had been made up from the epistle, it is impossible that this journey should have been passed over in silence. If the epistle had been composed out of what the author had read of St. Paul's history in the Acts, it is unaccountable that it should have been inserted." He also notes that St. Peter's visit to Antioch, during which the dispute arose between him and St. Paul, is also not mentioned in the book of Acts. And so that also points to independence between Acts and Galatians. He also notes in this quotation from the epistle, "I desire to be remarked how incidentally it appears that they fare past at Damascus. In what may be called the direct part of the account, no mention is made of the place of his conversion at all, a casual expression at the end, an expression brought in for a different purpose, and alone fixes it to have been at Damascus. I returned again to Damascus. Nothing could be more like simplicity and undesignedness than this is." It also draws the agreement between the two quotations somewhat closer to observe that they both state St. Paul to have preached the gospel immediately upon his call, and straightway he preached Christ in the synagogues, that he is the Son of God. Acts 9, chapter 9, verse 20. "When it pleased God to reveal his Son to me, that I might preach him among the heathen, immediately I conferred not with flesh and blood." Galatians chapter 1, verse 15. So here we have pretty strong evidence that Acts and Galatians are independent upon one another, and yet they converge on some of the particular facts. And that provides evidence for the account of which we read in Acts, actually reflecting Paul's own testimony, given the convergence and yet the independence of Acts and Galatians on those points. Here's another example. So in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 1, Paul says, "Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord?" In 1 Corinthians 15, 8 and 9, we read, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me, for I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. And so 1 Corinthians 15, 8 and 9 tell us that Jesus appeared to him in some way. Doesn't give us the specifics of which we read in Acts, but he has had some sort of encounter with the risen Jesus after his death. And then he adds, for I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. Very consistent again with what we see in Galatians and also what we see in the book of Acts. 1 Corinthians 9 also indicates that Paul has had some sort of encounter with the risen Jesus. Another instance of Paul narrating his own conversion experience is in 2 Corinthians 11, 32 to 33. This pertains to an event in the same chapter, namely when there was a plot made against Paul's life. And so he has to leave Damascus. It says at Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. Now, 2 Corinthians, again, is very clearly independent of Acts. We know this for a number of reasons. For example, Titus is mentioned in 2 Corinthians in various places, 2:13, 7:6, 7:13, 7:14, 8:6, 8:16, 8:23, 12:18, but he's nowhere mentioned in Acts. So that suggests independence between Acts and 2 Corinthians. Also, Paul's trials listed in 2 Corinthians 11 cannot be readily correlated with Acts. And so that, again, suggests that these sources are independent of one another. Also notice that 2 Corinthians 11 mentions that at Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus. Now, in the book of Acts, it's the Jews who are plotting to take Paul's life. There's no mention made there of the involvement of King Aretas, and evidently there must have been some sort of conspiracy involving King Aretas, the king of the Nabateans. This would be Aretas IV, and the Jews, but we don't read of this in Acts, and you would expect if one source were based on the other, that there would be some sort of explanation as to how those fit together, and yet there's not. And so, again, these are independent sources that converge on particular details. This is an example of an undesigned coincidence that corroborates an aspect of Acts 9. Again, so in Acts 9, of course, is the chapter that deals with Paul's conversion. So in Galatians 1:18, Paul says, in his own words, then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas. This is 3 years after his conversion, to visit Cephas, and remained with him 15 days. And this is also recounted in Acts chapter 9. But Acts does not mention that it was specifically for 15 days. That's a detail that we glean only from Galatians, and I've already shown that Acts and Galatians are very likely independent of one another. One author is not using the other as a source in his own for his own composition. Now, you might wonder, why such a short visit? Why only 15 days with Cephas? Well, if we turn over to Acts 9 again, verse 29, it says that Paul spoke and disputed against the Hellenists, but they were seeking to kill him. When the brothers learned this, they brought him down to Caesarea and sent him off to Tarsus. And so no further comment is necessary. Evidently, his visit with Cephas was cut short by this plot on his life. Okay, so the structure of the argument that's put forward by George Littleton in his book, Observations of the Conversion of St. Paul, is as follows. So I think that I've provided good evidence that the account in Galatians, in the book of Acts, chapter 9, most likely reflects Paul's own conversion testimony. Luke, as I've shown in previous sessions, was very probably a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. And based on those confirmations of various aspects of Acts 9 in Paul's letters, it seems very plausible that the narration that we read in Acts 9 derives from Paul's own testimony. That being the case, we have to give an explanation for why Paul made the claims that he did concerning his conversion experience on the road to Damascus. And of course, this presents us with another trilemma. Was he lying? Was he honestly mistaken? Or was he telling the truth? Now, the way that George Littleton parses this out is as follows: that Paul was either, number one, an impostor who said what he knew to be false with an intent to deceive. Number two, he was an enthusiast who imposed on himself the forces of an overheated imagination. Or third, he was deceived by the fraud of others. Or fourth, what he declared to be the cause of his conversion did all really happen, and therefore the Christian religion is a divine revelation. So let's turn to those candidate hypotheses to explain Paul's testimony concerning his conversion. Number one is Paul making stuff up? Is he lying? Is he saying what he knows to be false with an intent to deceive? Well, what sort of motivation might he have to deceive others into believing that he's had this Damascus Road conversion? Well, perhaps he was in it for financial gain, for the money. Well, this doesn't seem very plausible because, for instance, if we read 1 Corinthians 4, verses 11 through 13, we read, "To the present hour we hunger and thirst, we are poorly dressed and buffeted and homeless, and we labor, working with our own hands. When reviled, we bless. When persecuted, we endure. When slandered, we entreat. We have become and are still like the scum of the world and refuse of all things." So if Paul was in it for the money, it evidently didn't work out very well. Another example, 1 Corinthians 9, 14 through 18, in the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel, but I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision, for I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. And so it really doesn't look like Paul was in it for financial gain. Well, perhaps he was in it for the fame or notoriety. So, for example, 1 Corinthians 1, 23, though, says, "But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles." So this the message of the gospel may have gotten Paul notoriety, but it wasn't a good form of notoriety. It was the bad kind of notoriety. It was scoffed at by Gentiles and was a stumbling block to Jews. And in consequence of his proclamation of the gospel, he was subject to persecution. In fact, Paul went from being a highly respected Pharisee, trained under Gamaliel, no less, to joining the Christian movement. And so that seems like a very surprising move if he was simply in it for the notoriety and fame. He also says in Philippians 3, verses 4 through 6, "If anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless." And so again, he went from being this very well-respected Jewish Pharisee, very well-educated, and then he gave that up in order to join the Christian movement. 1 Corinthians 4, 9 through 10 tells us, "For I think that God has exhibited his apostles as last of all, like men sentenced to death, because we have become a spectacle to the world, to angels and to men. We are fools for Christ's sake, but you are wise in Christ. We are weak, but you are strong. You are held in honor, but we in disrepute." Again, it doesn't look like Paul is in it for the fame. Well, perhaps he's in it for the power. Well, in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 9, Paul says, "For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God." In Philippians 1, 15 through 18, "Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice." And so Paul seems to be more concerned about the message of the gospel being spread. It doesn't matter whether it's him or someone else who's doing so out of rivalry. He just wants the gospel to be proclaimed, whether from true motives or impure. And either way, he rejoices in that the gospel is being preached and that people are coming to a knowledge of Christ. So that also, I think, argues against the hypothesis that he's in it for the power. 1 Corinthians 3, 4-9 says, "For when one says, I follow Paul, another, I follow Apollos, are you not being merely human? What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building." Another relevant text is in Acts 14, 11-15, where we read, "When the crowd saw that Paul had done what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, the gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance to the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifices with the crowds. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying out, 'Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news, that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them.'" And so when Paul is treated by the Laconians as being a deity, he of course denounces that and says, "No, we're not deities. We're just men like you are." Again, that seems surprising if he's simply in it for power. 1 Thessalonians 2, 3-8. "For our appeal does not spring from error or impurity or any attempt to deceive, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so to speak, not to please men, but to please God who tests our hearts. For we never came with words of flattery, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed. God is witness." And so he's appealing to the Thessalonians that they know the sort of character that he had among them when he was visiting the Thessalonians. He continues, "Nor did we seek glory from people, whether from you or from others, though we could have made demands as apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. So being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you had become very dear to us." Again, it doesn't sound like Paul is simply in it for the power. Finally, 1 Thessalonians 2, 9-12, we read, "For you remember, brothers, our labor and toil. We worked night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you, while we proclaim to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct towards you believers. For you know how, like a father with his children, we exhorted each one of you and encouraged you and charged you to walk in a manner worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory." So again, appealing to the Thessalonians as witnesses to his character that he displayed in their midst. Well, perhaps he wasn't in it for the money or the power or fame, but he was in it for the girls. This also, I think, is very implausible. 1 Corinthians 7:8, for example, says, "To the unmarried and the widow, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am." Paul was single. He didn't take a wife, and he didn't pursue marriage. He believed, it seems, that he had the gift of singleness, and he saw his work in the ministry as being his primary objective and purpose in life. And he, although he doesn't think it's sinning to take a wife, to take a spouse, he nonetheless didn't want to be hindered in his ministry, and didn't want to be tied down with the responsibilities of starting a family when he felt called to the gospel ministry. 1 Corinthians 9:5 also, do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as did the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? So even though other disciples had and the brothers of the Lord, including James, had taken wives, he refrained from doing so for the purpose of the gospel. So again, that's also not a very good explanation for why Paul would make stuff up. So was Paul just making up pious lies? Well, it doesn't seem so when you examine the intense persecution to which Paul was subjected. So most famous and most extensive passage concerning this topic is in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 24 through 27, where we read, 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And so that doesn't seem like a very good motivation for making up pious lies when given the dangers to which he was subjected, the imprisonments, the floggings, the stonings, and so forth, the imprisonments, and ultimately martyrdom, that goes a long way towards establishing that he was at least sincere. Here's an undesigned coincidence that supports Paul's willingness to suffer such adversities and dangers and persecutions. 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 2 says, but though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict. So in Acts 16, 35 through 39, this provides a little bit of background to what is going on here. So it says, but when it was day, the magistrate sent the police saying, let those men go. And the jailer reported these words to Paul saying, the magistrates have sent to let you go. Therefore, come out now and go in peace. But Paul said to them, they have beaten us publicly, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into prison. And do they now throw us out secretly? No, let them come themselves and take us out. The police reported these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Roman citizens. So they came and apologized to them, and they took them out and asked them to leave the city. So in Acts 17, we read, now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, this Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ. And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. So according to Acts, Paul came to Thessalonica on the same missionary journey shortly after his mistreatment in Philippi. Paul had been outraged that he'd been flogged in spite of being a Roman citizen and imprisoned without trial by authorities at Philippi. And from the phrase, had been treated shamefully at Philippi, as you know, and from the text in Acts, one can envision Paul recounting the story, still full of indignation, to the new converts in Thessalonica. As I've argued with Acts and 2 Corinthians, and as I've argued with Acts and Galatians, so likewise Acts and 1 Thessalonians appear to be independent of one another. From Acts, it would naturally be inferred that Paul's converts at Thessalonica were all Jews, or at least Gentile God-fearers. But contrast that with 1 Thessalonians 1:9. You turn to God from idols to serve the living and true God. Or 1 Thessalonians 1, 9 and 10 says, for you remember, brothers, our labor and toil, we work night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you while we proclaim to you the gospel of God. So if the author of Acts were basing his account on Paul's letters, he would likely have made a clear reference to Paul staying in Thessalonica for a long time, long enough for him to be known for his integrity in financial matters and working night and day, that he might not be a burden to any of them and so forth. That seems like a natural thing that you might expect Acts to include a reference to. And as we see also the variation between Acts and 1 Thessalonians in terms of the identity of those who are converted. So in Acts 17:2, it says that Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures, and it mentions that many converted, including not a few of the leading women. Whereas in 1 Thessalonians, it says that they turn to God from idols to serve the living and true God, which suggests that people are coming from a pagan background. And these aren't necessarily incompatible, but it's interesting that they have different emphases. And so it seems that Acts and 1 Thessalonians are independent, and that, of course, strengthens the case from the undesigned coincidence I already alluded to. Here's another example of an undesigned coincidence supporting Paul's willingness to suffer adversity and persecution. 2 Timothy 3, 10 and 11. Paul says, "You, however, have followed my teaching, my conduct, my aim in life, my faith, my patience, my love, my steadfastness, my persecutions and sufferings that happened to me at Antioch, at Iconium, and at Lystra, which persecutions I endured, yet from them all the Lord rescued me." So the Antioch that he's talking about here was not Antioch, the capital of Syria, but rather it's Antioch in Pisidia, to which, as we read in Acts 13, Paul was sent along with Barnabas. And the sufferings that are mentioned here by Paul are described in Acts 13 and Acts 14. And Paul seems to imply in this text that Timothy actually witnessed these persecutions that happened to him in these cities. According to Acts, Paul made a second missionary journey through the same country. And the purpose of that trip is given in Acts 15:36, where it says, "After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, 'Let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are.'" So we learn that the purpose of the journey was to check on those who had been converted during the first journey to see how they were doing. In Acts 16, 1 and 2, we read, Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. So we're thus informed that either Derbe or Lystra was the hometown of Timothy. And it's clear from the text that Timothy had already been converted by the time of his visit, as Paul himself refers to Timothy as my true child in the faith and my beloved child in 1st and 2nd Timothy. And this indicates that Timothy was most likely Paul's own convert. So it then follows that Timothy was almost certainly converted upon Paul's previous journey through these cities at just the time when the apostle had undergone the persecutions alluded to in his letter to Timothy. There's also external testimony, that is, testimony that is external to the New Testament concerning Paul's suffering. So in 1 Clement, this is written by Clement of Rome. Most scholars date it to around AD 96. It was a bishop of the church in Rome, and he's writing a letter to the church in Corinth. And he says, and I quote, "But not to dwell upon ancient examples, let us come to the most recent spiritual heroes. Let us take the noble examples furnished in our own generation. Through envy and jealousy, the greatest and most righteous pillars of the church are being persecuted and put to death. Let us set before our eyes the illustrious apostles. Peter, through unrighteous envy, endured not one or two, but numerous labors, and when he had at length suffered martyrdom, departed to the place of glory due to him. Owing to envy, Paul also obtained the reward of patient endurance, after being 7 times thrown into captivity, compelled to flee, and stoned. After preaching both in the east and west, he gained the illustrious reputation due to his faith, having taught righteousness to the whole world, and come to the extreme limit of the west, and suffered martyrdom under the prefects. Thus was he removed from the world, and went into the holy place, having proved himself a striking example of patience." And so, given Paul's willingness to suffer and endure hardship, imprisonment, beatings, flogging, stoning, and so forth, shipwreck, it seems very unlikely that he was deliberately manufacturing his Damascus Road conversion. It seems that he at least is sincere in his statements about what happened. So that leaves us with either that he was merely honestly mistaken, or in fact that he did have such a Damascus Road encounter with the risen Jesus. So let's move on to the next contention, or the next hypothesis that's put forward by George Littleton, that he was an enthusiast who imposed on himself the forces of an overheated imagination. Well, was Paul an enthusiast? Well, George Littleton had this to say: "In different matters he became all things to all men. To the Jews he became a Jew. To them that are without law, as without law. To the weak he became weak, all that he might gain some. His zeal was eager and warm, but tempered with prudence. And even with the civilities and decorums of life, as appears by his behavior to Agrippa, Festus, and Felix, not the blind, inconsiderate, indecent zeal of an enthusiast." Was Paul depressed? Well, in Philippians 1, 21 through 24, Paul says, "For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. Yet which I shall choose, I cannot tell. I am hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. Philippians 4:4-7 also, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your mind in Christ Jesus. Was Paul stupid or credulous? Well, Paul was highly educated in Greek and Jewish learning. Paul commanded the respect of Agrippa and Felix. He was apparently trained under Gamaliel, a very prolific Jewish teacher. In Galatians 1:18-19, we read that after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remain with him 15 days, but I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. He goes for the purpose of confirming his gospel. He really wanted to make sure that he was in alignment with what was being preached. And he had opportunity to interview and speak with those who were eyewitnesses to Jesus' ministry and indeed resurrection as well. In Galatians 2, he also says, then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up because of a revelation and set before them, though privately before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles, in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. George Littleton says, and I quote, nothing less than the irresistible evidence of his own senses, clear from all possibility of doubt, could have overcome his unbelief. What about conversion disorder? This is basically a condition in which a person experiences physical and sensory problems such as paralysis, numbness, blindness. Of course, Paul does go blind, right, on the road to Damascus, deafness or seizures with no underlying neurologic pathology. Well, according to the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, women are 5 to 1 more like 5 to 1 or 5 times more likely to experience a conversion psychosis. And of course, Paul wasn't a woman. Adolescents, military persons in battle, people of low economic status, and those with a low IQ are also more likely prone to experience this phenomenon. And Paul doesn't fit those reference classes. And so it's less likely that explains his experience. What about thirdly, though, that he was deceived by the fraud of others? Well, it was impossible that the disciples of Christ could have thought of such a fraud given Paul's persecution against them. And also they were against liars. Remember what happened to Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5 after they lie about the price received for the land that they sold, where they're struck dead by God after they lied to Peter. And also the disciples were terrified of the Apostle Paul. It was also physically impossible, right? Could they produce a light brighter than the noonday sun? Could they cause him to hear a voice speaking out of that light? Could they make him blind for 3 days and then return his sight with a word, as Ananias does? Well, no one else on the road to Damascus saw Jesus. His traveling companions had some sensory experience of Paul's encounter. Paul was also blinded, and he was subsequently healed by the prayers of Ananias, right, in Acts 9, verses 8-19. And that also, I think, adds to the veridical nature of Paul's experience, that not only does he see this bright light and hear a voice that introduces himself to Jesus, not only does this have some sort of sensory impact on his companions, but he also is blinded by the experience and then later healed at a word by Ananias, who's being told about Paul through direct revelation. And also before King Agrippa, Paul appealed to public facts that the king would be aware of in Acts 26, verses 23-26. No fraud could have produced Paul's miracles. 2 Corinthians 12:12, Paul refers to the signs of a true apostle that were performed among you with utmost patience, with signs and wonders and mighty works. He's actually appealing to the Corinthians and their testimony of the miraculous works that he did, that he calls the signs of an apostle that were performed in their midst. Romans 15:18-19 says, for I will not venture to speak of anything except what Christ has accomplished through me to bring the Gentiles to obedience by word and deed, by the power of signs and wonders, by the power of the Spirit of God. And so again, another allusion to these signs and wonders that Paul considered to be the signs of a true apostle that he performs among people to vindicate his apostolic identity. And that also, I think, is of evidential value in confirming his prophetic identity. We also read about his miracles in the book of Acts, which is consistent with Paul's own testimony. In Acts 19, for example, 11 and 12, we read that God was doing extraordinary miracles by the hands of Paul, so that even handkerchiefs or aprons that to touch his skin were carried away to the sick, and their diseases left them, and the evil spirits came out of them. So that leaves us with the final explanation, which is the one that I myself adopt, which is that what he declared to be the cause of his conversion did all really happen, and therefore the Christian religion is a divine revelation. Now let's look at a few objections to the testimony of Paul concerning his conversion. So here's Bart Ehrman on Paul's conversion. He writes, and I quote, "On 3 occasions, Acts narrates the conversion of Paul on the road to Damascus, chapters 9, 22, and 26. Compare them closely to one another, and you'll find very odd contradictions. So, for example, between Acts 9 and Acts 22, do Paul's companions hear anything? Acts 9 versus Acts 26, are Paul's companions knocked out, or are they standing? Acts 9 and 22 versus Acts 26, is Paul instructed by Ananias or not?" He says, all these examples simply show that Luke was far more interested in telling a gripping story than he was in being consistent. His artistic license has seriously undercut his historical accuracy. So let's look at those in turn. Ehrman says, in chapter 9, Paul's companions hear the voice of Jesus talking to Paul, but they don't see anyone. In chapter 22, they see the light, but don't hear anything. Which is it? Well, let's look at the text for ourselves. Acts 9 verse 7 says, the men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing, akuntes in Greek, the voice, but seeing no one. Acts 22:9, now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand. Ekousan is a different word in Greek, the voice of the one he was speaking to me. Now, can uk ekousan be translated as they did not understand? Well, the NIV translates it, did not understand. The English Standard Version did not understand, as does the NASB, as does the New English Translation, as does the KJV, and indeed Luke 6:27. Jesus says, but I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. And in that context, akusin means clearly those who understand. So this is not a question. So this is a question about interpretation, not, as Ehrman represents it, about the plain meaning of the text. So they presumably heard the voice, though they did not understand what was being said. Ehrman also objects. In chapter 9, the companions are left standing while Paul falls to the ground. In chapter 26, they are all knocked to the ground. Which is it? So Acts 9 verse 7 says, the men who were traveling with him stood speechless, whereas Acts 26:14 says, and when we had all fallen to the ground. So there are 3 possibilities here. Number 1, the expression stood speechless is simply an idiomatic expression that means that they stopped dead, not that they were standing up the whole time. Second, the expression stood speechless is simply Luke's editorial voice in paraphrasing the story he has heard, a very mild editorial license in view of the conventions of the time. Or third, Paul told the story several times with minor variations of this sort, and Luke is reporting it the way Paul told it one of those times. Ehrman also objects, and I quote, in chapters 9 and 22, Paul is told to go to Damascus to be instructed by a man named Ananias about what to do next. In chapter 26, Paul is not told to go to be instructed by Ananias. Instead, Jesus himself instructs him. Well, which is it? But Paul does not say in his speech in Acts 26 that he was not told to go be instructed by Ananias. He simply does not mention Ananias. The omission in Luke's narration of Paul's speech is not an assertion of the contrary, but Ehrman needs it to function as a contrary assertion in order to generate a contradiction. So Ehrman, on his internal contradictions, says, and I quote, all these examples simply show that Luke was far more interested in telling a gripping story than he was in being consistent. His artistic license has seriously undercut his historical accuracy. But on the contrary, these examples show that Ehrman is far more interested in impugning the historical accuracy of Acts than he is in representing the text fairly. His rhetorical excesses have seriously undercut his credibility. What about external objections? So we've looked at a few internal objections that Ehrman puts forward. What about external objections to the account in Acts? Well, here's another quote from Bart Ehrman. He says, and I quote, when Paul himself talks about his conversion in Galatians 1, he insists that after he had his vision of Jesus, he absolutely and positively did not, he swears to it, go to confer with the other apostles in Jerusalem, not for years. And what happens when Paul converts, according to Acts 9, what is the first thing he does after he leaves Damascus? He makes a beeline to Jerusalem to confer with the other apostles. In Acts, he does precisely what he himself swears he didn't do. But here's what Acts 9 actually says. It says, many days had passed, the Jews plotted to kill him, but their plot became known to Saul. They were watching the gates day and night in order to kill him, but his disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. So how long a period of time is denoted by many days? Notice in verse 23, when many days had passed. Well, the expression is indefinite and can mean any longish span of time. So, for example, in 1 Kings 2, 38 and 39, the expression many days in Hebrew is immediately glossed as 3 years. That is some part of each of the 3 consecutive years, between 1 and 3 years, as we would reckon it. One might object, but doesn't it sound like Luke doesn't know how long Paul waited before he went to Jerusalem? But telescoping of narrative may be at work here, omitting details unimportant to the principal theme, here Paul's apostolic commission to the Gentiles. And if Luke was unaware of the exact span of time, what of it? That one relatively unimportant detail hardly shows that he was unfamiliar with Paul's life and mission. Now, it's certainly true that in Acts 9, when there's the attempt made on his life and he has to flee, he's in Damascus, whereas Galatians mentions that he went away into Arabia. But according to Galatians, he returned again to Damascus. And so I would say that the trip to Arabia, where he's presumably being instructed by God and receiving divine counsel, took place within that span of that Acts simply glosses over as many days. So I don't really see that as being a particularly strong alleged discrepancy. Here's a second objection. This is a quote from Richard Carrier. He says, and I quote, for example, we know Paul was unknown by faith to the churches of Judea until many years after his conversion, as he explains in Galatians 1, 22 and 23. And after his conversion, he went away to Arabia before returning to Damascus, and he didn't go to Jerusalem for at least 3 years, as he explains in Galatians 1, 15 through 18, whereas Acts 7 through 9 has him known and interacting with the Jerusalem church continuously from the beginning, even before his conversion. But let's read Acts a bit more carefully. So Acts 8, verses 1 through 3 indicates that Paul had been involved in persecuting the church in Jerusalem to be distinguished from the whole region of Judea. Acts 8:1, in fact, indicates that the believers in Jerusalem, quote, were scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria. They no doubt would have told other believers with whom they came into contact of the persecution they had experienced under Saul of Tarsus, but it doesn't follow that the churches in Judea would generally have known him by sight, although they would doubtless have known him by reputation. So in conclusion, then, I'll quote from George Littleton's book, Observations on the Conversion of St. Paul. He says, and I quote, some difficulties occur in the Christian religion, which human reason can hardly clear, but as the truth of it stands upon evidence so strong and convincing that it cannot be denied without much greater difficulties than those that attend the belief of it, as I have before endeavored to prove, we ought not to reject it upon such objections, however mortifying they may be to our pride. That indeed would have all things made plain to us. But God has thought proper to proportion our knowledge to our wants, not our pride. All that concerns our duty is clear. And as to other points, either of natural or revealed religion, if he has left some obscurities in them, is that any reasonable cause of complaint? Not to rejoice in the benefit of what he has graciously allowed us to know, from a presumptuous disgust at our incapacity of knowing more, is as absurd as it would be to refuse to walk because we cannot fly. And I'll finish there, and happy to entertain any questions.